couple of weeks before Christmas, Davy Boy suggested that it might be interesting if I made videos reading from a book, a sort of YouTube book at bedtime. At the time, I was busy sorting through my axes, trying to decide which to grind next. But Davy's suggestion was more interesting. The problem then was what to read. After all, I'm not the most gluttonous of bookworms. In 1969, William Burroughs gave me a copy of the recently published Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda. Superficially, it was about psychedelic plants such as peyote. In fact, it was the first in a series of books which outlined the knowledge needed before tasting such drugs. They are anthropological works, outlining the transcendental knowledge and wisdom of North American Indians. I was captivated and devoured each successive sequel as it was published over the ensuing years. Anthropology, the study of culture, has taught us that the world is understood differently in different places. By exploring other cultures, we can see that our understanding of the world is not the only way. In so doing, we burrow beneath ideology and come to understand the common denominators of all cultures, the characteristics that all human beings share in common. I do not intend to read these books cover to cover, only those parts which I feel are particularly relevant to the personal and social problems of our times. In the summer of 1960, while I was an anthropology student at the University of California, I made several trips to the southwest to collect information on the medicinal plants used by the Indians of the area. The events I describe here began during one of my trips. I was waiting in a border town for a Greyhound bus, talking with a friend who had been my guide and helper in the survey. Suddenly he leaned towards me and whispered that the man, a white-haired old Indian who was sitting in front of the window, was very learned about plants, especially peyote. I asked my friend to introduce me. My friend greeted him, then went over and shook his hand. After they'd talked for a while, my friend signaled me to join them, but immediately left me alone with the old man, not even bothering to introduce us. He was not in the least embarrassed. I told him my name, and he said that he was called Juan, and that he was at my service. He used the polite Spanish form of address. We shook hands at my initiative, and then remained silent for some time. It was not a strained silence, but a quietness, natural and relaxed on both sides. Though his dark face and neck were wrinkled, showing his age, it struck me that his body was agile and muscular. I then told him I was interested in obtaining information about medicinal plants. Although in truth I was almost totally ignorant about peyote, I found myself pretending that I knew a great deal, even suggesting that it might be to his advantage to talk with me. As I rattled on, he nodded slowly and looked at me, but said nothing. I avoided his eyes, and we finished by standing, the two of us, in dead silence. Finally, after what seemed a very long time, Don Juan got up and looked out of the window. His bus had come. He said goodbye and left the station. I was annoyed at having talked nonsense to him and being seen through by those remarkable eyes. When my friend returned, he tried to console me for my failure to learn anything from Don Juan. He explained that the old man was often silent or non-committal, but the disturbing effect of this first encounter was not so easily dispelled. I made a point of finding out where Don Juan lived, and later visited him several times. On each visit I tried to lead him to discuss peyote, but without success. We became nonetheless very good friends, and my scientific investigation was forgotten, or at least redirected into other channels that were worlds apart from my original intention. The friend who had introduced me to Don Juan explained later that the old man was not a native of Arizona, where we met, but was a Yaqui Indian from Sonora in Mexico. At first I saw Don Juan simply as a rather peculiar man who knew a great deal about peyote and who spoke Spanish remarkably well. But the people with whom he lived believed that he had some sort of secret knowledge, that he was a brujo. The Spanish word brujo means in English medicine man, cura, witch, sorcerer. It connotes essentially a person with extraordinary powers. I had known Don Juan for a whole year before he took me into his confidence. One day he explained that he possessed a certain knowledge that he'd learned from a teacher, a benefactor as he called him, who had directed him in a kind of apprenticeship. Don Juan had in turn chosen me to serve as his apprentice, but he warned me that I would have to make a very deep commitment and that the training was long and arduous. Don Juan never mentioned the place where he acquired his knowledge, nor did he identify his teacher. In fact, Don Juan disclosed very little about his personal life. All he said was he was born in the Southwest in 1891, that he had spent nearly all his life in Mexico, that in 1900 his family was exiled by the Mexican government to central Mexico, along with thousands of other Sonoran Indians, and that he had lived in central and southern Mexico until 1940. Thus, as Don Juan had travelled a great deal, his knowledge may have been the product of many influences. And although he regarded himself as an Indian from Sonora, I was not sure whether to place the context of his knowledge totally in the culture of the Sonoran Indians. But it is not my intention here to determine his precise cultural milieu. I began to serve my apprenticeship to Don Juan in 1961. Prior to that time, I had seen him on various occasions, but always in the capacity of an anthropological observer. During these early conversations, I took notes in a covert manner. Later, relying on my memory, I reconstructed the entire conversation. When I began to participate as an apprentice, however, that method of taking notes became very difficult, because our conversations touched on many different topics. Then Don Juan allowed me, under strong protest, however, to record openly anything that was said. I would also have liked to take photographs and make tape recordings, but he would not permit me to do so. I carried out the apprenticeship first in Arizona and then in Sonora, because Don Juan moved to Mexico during the course of my training. The procedure I employed was to see him for a few days, every so often. My visits became more frequent and lasted longer during the summer months between 1961 and 1964. In retrospect, I believe this method of conducting the apprenticeship prevented the training from being successful, because it retarded the advent of the full commitment I needed to become a sorcerer. Yet the method was beneficial from my personal standpoint, in that it allowed me a modicum of detachment, and that in turn fostered a sense of critical examination which would have been impossible to attain had I participated continuously. In September 1965, I voluntarily discontinued the apprenticeship. I should add that there is considerable controversy surrounding Carlos' later years. The clinical explanation, as far as I can see, is that he developed a peyote psychosis.